Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Public Affairs at CG. And the interview clip you were just watching was a preview of our new podcast series, Inside the Issues. And this one featured the CG Distinguished Fellow Paul Heimbecker on Canada's downsizing diplomacy. And Paul is on our panel tonight. Happy New Year, and welcome back to CG's public programming. Our first event for 2011 is tonight's panel, WikiLeaks, Security, Diplomacy, and Global Gossip. WikiLeaks, as you probably know if you're interested enough to come out tonight, is an international not-for-profit founded in 2006, 2007. It's a website, and it acts as an intermediary between whistleblowers and the public. And it became even more controversial than it's ever been this past fall when thousands of diplomatic cables were posted to the website. So that's our topic, and just before we launch in, we'd like to acknowledge in our audience Peter Braid, MP for Kitchener-Waterloo. We're very grateful to our funding partners in the Government of Canada and the province of Ontario. I'll now introduce our moderator, and he'll introduce our panelists after declaring his own bias on the issue. Jeffrey Stevens is our moderator tonight, and he's a journalist, author, and teacher. He's been the Ottawa columnist, sports editor, and managing editor of the Globe and Mail, and the Ottawa correspondent for the Time magazine and managing editor of Maclean's magazine. He writes a column on politics every Monday in The Record in Kitchener-Waterloo and the Mercury in Guelph. Mr. Stevens is the author or co-author of 4 books on political subjects, the most recent of which is The Player, The Life and Times of Dalton Camp, which won the Writers' Trust of Canada's Drainey Taylor Prize for the Best Biography of 2003. And 2 of his books were chosen by Samara Canada in July 2010 for its Best of Canadian Political Books. He's currently working with the Honourable Flora MacDonald on her memoirs. In June 2007, Mr. Stevens was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Letters by Laurier for his unique and outstanding lifelong contribution to political reporting and public discourse across Canada, and he's a director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, chair of the CGF's Lifetime Achievement Jury, and a judge of the annual National Newspaper Awards. And so therefore very interested in the WikiLeaks issue, which is also a media issue. I want to thank tonight's sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, and I also want to thank our webcast audience for attending. Later on tonight, all audience members will have a chance to ask questions from the mics that'll be open towards the end of the evening, and we'll also be taking questions from our webcast audience. So now I'll turn it over to Jeff Stevens. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Fred. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be here this evening for this event on a topic which is of immense interest, the WikiLeaks saga, which is certainly not over. It's all unfolding in front of us. My job is supposed to be a fairly minimal job here. My job is to introduce the panelists and then get out of the way and let them go at it, and then give you a chance to go at them. The plan is that we will take the first hour or so for the panel. They will speak for about 5 minutes each, and there will be some back and forth among the panelists. And after that, a little after 8 o'clock, I will declare the session open to questions from both the audience here and those watching the webcast podcast. So try to get as much participation as we can, and that'll go on until half an hour, 45 minutes or so of audience participation. Fred said that I would declare my bias, so I'll do that. I'm not sure, given my bias, that I should be a moderator, but I will do my best to be even-handed. I spent 15 years in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. That was through the period of the evolution, introduction, and ultimately passage of the Access to Information Act, a subject which I have written about many, many times. My bias is that I am an open government person. I believe that the government, which gathers information at the taxpayer's expense, should make that information available to the public, all of that information, unless there's some compelling reason why they should not make it available. Otherwise, I think the test has to be on the government to explain why it's not going to make information available. The test should not be on the public to provide information, information as to why they should be given that access. That's my basic bias. I was in the gallery in Ottawa in the mid-'60s when the first private members' attempts to introduce freedom of information legislation began. Barry Mather from the NDP, Jed Baldwin from the Conservatives, and John Reid from the Liberals all introduced private members' bills over a period of years. And of course, the governments weren't much interested in that. Those efforts, didn't really want freedom of information, and the bills all died on the order paper. One of those three, John Reid, ultimately became the Information Commissioner. And I had actually, after he stepped down as Information Commissioner, I had a chance to talk to him at another conference, and he was saying, you know, all the years I was Information Commissioner, it was 7 or 8 years, I guess, he said, I had hundreds of occasions to look at documents which the government was trying to prevent from being released, and he would review the documents. He was Privy Councillor, he had that sort of access. He reviewed those documents. He said, I didn't find one single case where there was some compelling reason why the government information could not be made public, national security, national defense, or anything else. What I did find in every case was a desire by the government to avoid embarrassment in the publication of this information. It's not terribly surprising that when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, he did not reappoint John Reid as Information Commissioner. However, John, I covered the introduction of the Access to Information Bill in 1979. Joe Clark picked it up in that election campaign. He wanted an issue which he thought would be popular. I don't know whether it was or not, but he picked that issue up, introduced the legislation to create what is now the Access to Information Act. Unfortunately, the government fell before it got passed, but Pierre Trudeau picked it up in his, when he came back to power in 1980 and proceeded with that legislation, which ultimately passed and came into force in 1983. I guess I'm like most people in the journalistic community. I'm really disappointed in the act. I'm disappointed in the way it's drafted. I think there are huge loopholes in it. It leaves far too much leeway to the government. There are not proper time constraints in the production of documents, all kinds of difficulties with the act. But I'm more disappointed in the reaction of governments in not dealing with the act and trying to make it possible for the public to find out what their government is really up to. Gives you just one small example. 2000, trying to remember the year, in 2000, I think, there was a young reporter from the Globe and Mail, was posted to Ottawa. He didn't know anybody in town. And what do you do when you don't know anybody? We spent a lot of time hanging around the House of Commons, talking to people, saying, what's going on, what do I need to know? And he started hearing rumors about a funny program operating out of the Prime Minister's office, giving money to people in Quebec to promote certain things. He put in an access to information request for some documents that should have been readily available. These are documents from reports on advertising campaigns. It took 2 years before the government finally gave him the information, and that blew open, of course, the sponsorship scandal, which Sheila Fraser, as the Auditor General, picked up on, and then ultimately we had the Mr. Justice Gomery with his inquiry into that situation. $320 million of taxpayers' money, which sort of down that rat hole. And if the government had had its way, of course, none of that information would ever have come out. So I am an open government person. That's my bias. I will try to control it as we go on this evening. Let me start. What I'm going to do, I will just briefly identify each of the panelists, and then I'll come up and introduce them more properly before they speak. Okay? We are going to start tonight with Mark McCardle on my extreme right. Our second speaker will be the speaker on my immediate left, Paul Heinbecker, who has already been identified and by Fred Kuntz. And then our final speaker will be Professor Andrew Hunt, from the University of Waterloo. I think it's a nice mix of a panel. We have a very experienced, very distinguished, and very seasoned diplomat in Paul Heinbecker. We have a technology expert software person in Paul McCardle, and we have an historian in the person of Andrew Hunt. So I think it's a nice mix. I will just say a few words first to introduce Mark McCardle. He has over 18 years of technical experience in some of the best brands in technology. He started off as a software developer at MKS and OpenText. He moved from this region down to Silicon Valley and joined PGP, which I had not heard of before, but I have now heard of, and he was there for 11 years and became Senior Vice President of Consumer Product Development. That's a company which was, as I recall, was taken over by McCardle. Is that correct?
McAfee.
Yeah, okay. In September 2009, Mark joined Venture Services Group of Communitech in this area as executive in residence. And he's been working closely with many early stage startups in the Waterloo region, including the one he's with now, which is called Tiny Hippos. It's a lovely name, Tiny Hippos. In November of 2010, he became CEO of Tiny Hippos. So Mark can talk to us a lot about the technology aspects of WikiLeaks, and he also has some views on the propriety of some of this information which is made available. Mark, call on you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you. I guess as the token geek on the panel, I'll talk about WikiLeaks through the lens of technology. And really, I think the place to start is to recognize that technology has really facilitated the types of disclosures that we're dealing with today. And Cablegate represents a pretty big one. The scale of things today is much different than it was 15 years ago, before the internet had really taken off. The fundamental disclosure problem isn't new. We've always had secrets, whether they're individual or government, but the ability to control the secrets was different just because they were physical secrets. They weren't digital. The growth in the technology scale, where miniaturization, the amount of physical capacity and storage that we all have in our pockets. My BlackBerry here is a great device that has gigabytes of storage on it. In my coat pocket, I could have a small device that fits nicely in that little pocket that could store over a terabyte of data. That's a massive amount of data. I think if we look at at how the publication model has also changed over time because of technology, you used to have to find someone to go and publish, in the old term, the old print world, what the secret was or the disclosure was. And there was, a lot of editorial oversight in those organizations. They weren't just going to lightly, willy-nilly publish anything that somebody throws at them. They would often fact check, and there'd be a rigor to the process. Technology has made everyone in this room potentially a publisher, and anyone who finds something they think is intriguing is just minutes away from publishing it to the world. Whether anyone notices is a different challenge, but if you're controversial enough, wacky enough, if you can get the attention somehow, then those disclosures can start to gain momentum. Now, I don't see that the disclosure problem here is fundamentally a government one. I think right now the U.S. government is a big target from the WikiLeaks organization. I think I'll put my personal biases on the back end of my comments. I'll keep this on tech right now, but I think the U.S. government's feeling the sharp end of this stick. But it's really not fundamentally a government issue. This is one that we all have to deal with, because we all work for organizations that have secrets. And having secrets is not inherently evil. When we're in a negotiation for buying a house, I know how much I want to spend. I don't want the other guy to know how much I'm going to spend. That's a secret. I wouldn't want that being disclosed. The companies we all work for, they have trade secrets. They have IP. We've all seen big headline cases about what happens when either IP is compromised or malappropriated. These are powerful assets that have great value, and technology is making these lines that we used to draw pretty clearly pretty gray and vague in a lot of ways. So we all sort of have a responsibility and a seat at this table, because what WikiLeaks is a really exciting, meaty, juicy topic that's very timely. I think it sheds a light on how technology comes to bear on how we manage assets, whether they're our own private secrets, our own sensitive information about maybe our healthcare records, our finances, pictures of my kids on Facebook. You know, we live in an age of WikiLeaks and Facebook, and personal privacy is a responsibility that we all sort of have to take on, lest someone else decide what I have or what anyone in this room has in terms of a secret may be subject to disclosure that we wouldn't want. So that's sort of my view from the technology perspective. I'll just quickly speak about my personal view on this whole WikiLeaks thing. I think there's a powerful and important responsibility for whistleblowers in society. You know, our leaders are accountable to us, and without whistleblowers, without the brave people who see wrongdoing and stand up and disclose what they see that they believe is truly wrong, we're compromised. We're not as good a society as we need to be. But in this case, I'm struggling with whether WikiLeaks qualifies, frankly, as a whistleblower, because there's so much data. And it's a wholesale theft. If I was looking at this from an enterprise data perspective, they've just stolen a lot of enterprise data and they're dripping it out without any clear smoking gun, without anything that clearly indicates that wrongdoing has occurred. It's titillating. It's great cocktail conversation. You know, I think it's entertaining that Muammar Gaddafi, his nurse is a Russian, you know, voluptuous woman, and he may be having an affair. But I don't know that I need to know that in order to have trust in my government. So that's, I guess, where I kind of view this personally. And I'll obviously waiting to see how this plays out in terms of all the rest of the disclosures that are being held hostage, I guess, right now.
Hi, I'm Paul Heinbecker. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't get off that easily. No. Okay.
I won't do it all.
No, start.
Yeah, so start at the end. Our next panelist is Paul Heinbecker, who is well known to everybody at CG as a distinguished fellow here. He's also the inaugural director of the Laurier University Center for Global Relations, and he writes extensively on many subjects involving the world of foreign policy and diplomacy. Paul began his career as a junior diplomat in places like Turkey, Sweden, the OECD. He actually wrote speeches for Pierre Trudeau at one point, which must have been a bit of a challenge. I don't know. He returned to Canada in 1989. Well, he was Minister Counselor in political affairs at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, working on the acid rain file and political military affairs, including arms control and NORAD. When he returned to Canada in 1989, he served as Prime Minister Mulroney's chief foreign policy advisor and speechwriter. And in 1991, he was Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Foreign and Defense Policy. In the summer of 2000, Mr. Heinbecker was appointed Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations, where he promoted the International Criminal Court, the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was endorsed subsequently at the largest summit meeting in UN history. He also led the Canadian delegation to the UN Human Rights Conference in Durban. He has honorary degrees from both Laurier and St. Thomas University, and in 2003, he was named Alumnus of the Year at Laurier. So I'd like to please welcome Paul Heinbecker.
Thank you very much for not indicating the date on which I joined the Foreign Service. That's a secret between me and my maker, I guess. If I'm grimacing, it isn't because I've heard something I don't like necessarily. It's because I was walking out on the street and I fell on the sidewalk, and I think I may have a cracked rib or something. So I will be doing a lot of shifting, trying to find a comfortable position. and don't interpret my facial gestures necessarily as meaning that I'm about to erupt about something. I'm not going to debate with Jeff the rationale for the Access to Information Act. I agree with it, basically. I probably would be more on the side of precautions than he would be. But generally speaking, I think that it's essential in a democratic society. I have no doubt about that. But what we're really talking about tonight is not access to our government's information. It's access to, in this particular case, American government information. And what I'd like to talk about is what I think the consequences are of that. There's process consequences and there are substance consequences. I have to keep an eye on the clock. Gee, I'm almost finished. I haven't started yet. Too much of a play for sympathy. On process, it is a big problem if you cannot, as a diplomat, count on the conversations you have being kept confidential, both in terms of reporting to your own government and in terms of what others disclosing it. For example, Scott Gilmore is a Canadian diplomat, or was a Canadian diplomat, who was active in East Timor. He was at our embassy in Jakarta. He was meeting with human rights advocates at a time when it was extremely dangerous. He was meeting with them more or less in secret. They were giving him evidence of crimes that had been committed against these human rights activists, including photos of people who were murdered. How could he continue to do that if the person, his interlocutor, thought that the next day this could be revealed in a cable and might be ending up on the front page of the newspaper? That, it's a bit like being a journalist. The source is going to dry up, and it's not in the interest of the diplomat, and it's certainly not in the interest, in this case, of the human rights person. Same thing goes with our ambassador, for example, in Afghanistan, where he made some very true what he thought confidential comments to his American counterpart. Now he sees it in the newspaper, and he has to deal with the people that he has been saying these things about. It doesn't make it any easier. So there's a serious process problem. There's also a serious substance problem. For example, most of you will not have read, how many documents are out now? 3,000? There's 260,000 to go or something like that. You won't have time to read those. Even if you read them, I would argue most of you, including me, wouldn't be in a position to interpret them. But leaving that aside, these documents are out there. What's the harm? Well, in one case, it was revealed that the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. government, was trying to withdraw enriched uranium from a Pakistan nuclear reactor, and that they were unsuccessful in doing it. This is the reason you're trying to remove that material is because it's dangerous if somebody else gets their hands on it. Now it's clear. Today's paper, they talked about there's a U.S. document indicating the sensitive infrastructure that there's a, what do we call it? Anyway, those kind of things where if there was a terrorist attack, it could be a big problem, like pipelines, communications nodes, and so on. All of the American concerns are now public. That's a shortcut for terrorists to blow these things up. Is that in the public interest? Is it in the public interest that the terrorists are able to access that kind of information? I don't think that's the case. Korea. A lot of information has been released about Korea. You haven't read it all. I'd be willing to bet that nobody in this audience has read it all. I'd also be willing to bet that in Pyongyang, they're reading it all. This is a regime that's reality challenged. They attacked South Korea twice in the last 6 months. They've got nuclear weapons. An attack by North Korea on Seoul could cause tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of casualties in about an hour. Is it a good idea to be providing that kind of information to the North Korean regime? There are other examples, but those I think make the point. The second point I'd like to make is what happens as a consequence. Mr. Assange, I think, believes, I guess his motivation is that the American government is somehow an immoral operation and needs to be exposed. He doesn't seem to be exposing the Chinese government, the Russian government, or a lot of other governments who are a lot less accountable to their citizens than the American government is. So what does that mean? What's going to happen? You will have noticed that there have been no top secret documents released. At least I haven't seen any. And above top secret, by the way, there are more classifications. What will happen is not that the government will say, oh my goodness, this is the modern age, this is a technological age, people have a right to know. What government will say is we have to protect this information for the reasons I've just given and a lot of other reasons. And they will go to greater and greater efforts to make sure people don't get it. They'll do it by compartmentalizing information so people, the number of people who get their hands on that information will be reduced and the risk will be reduced. That will make it harder, by the way, to connect the dots about an ex-terrorist attack, because part of the reason that this has been opened up is because the U.S. system was transformed in order to share information. Now one will have to see whether that can continue. So the governments will protect the information. They'll do it by various means. My guess is you're going to see a lot more telephone calls. You're going to see a lot more satellite communications. That stuff can all be done confidentially. People can't break into it. There'll be no records. There'll be no paper. People might even fly home if they have something they think is particularly sensitive to say. And what you'll end up with in the end is not an access to information regime that works for everybody and shows everybody everything they need to know except what's really a secret. What you'll end up with is people stopping to put things down in records. And so the public won't know, and historians won't know, and the net result of this effort to open up the system will be to close it further. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Andrew Hunt, our next speaker, is an associate professor of history at the University of Waterloo. He was born in Calgary and raised in California and Utah, where he did his university work. He's the author of a couple of books. At Waterloo now he specializes in U.S. history, and he teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, Vietnam War, conspiracy theories in American history, I'd like to take that one, and the history of the American West. He has a new course coming next year called Rock and Roll and United States History. Interesting course. He's in the process of writing a book about Ronald Reagan. He says he's a Reagan nut himself. Writing a book on Ronald Reagan and researching also something on George McGovern, who was the Democratic candidate in, I think, '72 for president. He writes a blog on veganism and animal rights, or veganism and animal rights. Andrew?
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thank you. I was thrilled to come out tonight. And I appreciate the invitation. I'm honored to share the stage with these gentlemen. And I come here in my capacity really as a historian, with a historian's interest in WikiLeaks. And I should mention at the outset that my people in my profession, historians, tend to be very reluctant to weigh in on contemporary events. We like to have at least a good 30 to 40 years separating us from the events that we're analyzing. And I tend to like that little comfort padding myself, which is why Jeff mentioned that I'm researching the Reagan era and the Cold War of that period. And actually I'm worked with some recently declassified U.S. government documents, so I know what a lot of those documents look like, and I really look at this with from a historian's very pragmatic point of view, a belief that with all these documents that we're being inundated with, it will take us quite some time to make sense of what we're seeing. Paul mentioned that there have been so many documents already that have been placed online, and they're still in the process of placing clusters of documents online on a daily basis. And this will take quite some time to make sense of these documents. I actually was asked by Fred Kuntz to come and participate in this panel after I wrote a piece in the Record in which I compared Julian Assange to Daniel Ellsberg, who was the main figure 40 years ago in the leaking of the Pentagon Papers. And unfortunately, the problem with writing a newspaper column like that is I don't have the space that I would really like to have to kind of weigh in and get into the nuances of these issues, because even though I compared Assange and Ellsberg, I also think there are a lot of very stark differences too between the Pentagon Papers of 40 years ago, which was up to WikiLeaks the biggest leaking of classified documents, and WikiLeaks today. And I wasn't really able to emphasize those differences as much as I would have liked. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pentagon Papers, actually this year, now my historian thing kicking in, I'm going back into the 20th century, back in time again. This year, 2011, marks the 40th anniversary of the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, which was this massive government study commissioned by then Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara in 1967, in which he had a group of analysts handpicked that he asked to go through all kinds of top secret government documents and produce a history of the Vietnam War and U.S. involvement in Indochina. And this was done over a period of several years, and there were many key figures involved with this. Often the person that gets credited with leaking this study out to the public is, of course, Daniel Ellsberg. Although we now know that Daniel Ellsberg was certainly not alone in the leaking of these documents, that there were numerous others involved, including some of his colleagues working on the study, people like Mort Halperin and so forth, and as well as staffers from Edward Kennedy's office and various others who were part of this. Just like Julian Assange is often the figure that we single out when he's the face that we place on WikiLeaks, there are many others involved in WikiLeaks too, and this was the case with the Pentagon Papers. This was not a one-man operation. But Daniel Ellsberg was just a very, very quick overview of him. He was a fascinating figure, a man who actually served in Vietnam, initially very anti-communist, very supportive of Kennedy's policies there, and as well as Lyndon Johnson's policies there in the 1960s. And a man who was considered one of the whiz kids, a young, very up-and-coming kind of figure who, very early in his life, he was in his mid-20s when he got his PhD from Harvard, and just a brilliant young man who was apparently reading philosophy when he was 8 and all kinds of stuff. And very much a very interesting figure in American history, but ultimately when he was piecing together the Pentagon Papers, he became very, very disillusioned with what he saw, and what he saw told him that there had been this systematic pattern of lies and deception going up to the highest levels of government, having to do with American involvement in Vietnam, and Ellsberg thought it was his duty to release those documents to the public. And that's exactly what he did. He actually began photocopying them because that was the technology that he had to rely on, an old photocopier. And he, believe it or not, he had to actually start because the study was so huge, of 47 volumes, tens of thousands and thousands of government documents. And he actually had to start photocopying them in 1969, and he was, I think, standing at that damn copy machine for 2 years before he eventually leaked. And in this way, leak is actually, he had to go to the local store and buy a dolly to haul these gigantic boxes. Not much of a leak, you think. That's actually almost killing yourself to carry these boxes out. And he delivered them to a New York Times reporter, very prominent Pulitzer Prize winner, Neil Sheehan, who eventually oversaw the appearance of the Pentagon Papers. My time's about up, so I'm just going to wrap up really quickly to say that my interest has to do with, and I often refer back to the Pentagon Papers, and I might do that while I'm talking tonight, but I like to kind of compare and contrast these leaks, because I think in some ways they're very similar, but in some ways they're very different. And I'll probably be referring back to the Pentagon Papers as I talk more tonight later on, but suffice it to say that up till WikiLeaks, that was the most significant dumping of documents. And I think it's important to point out that now we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of that very historic, very important event that really changed so much in American history. And it's interesting that Assange was actually born in 1971, which is when Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to Neil Sheehan of the New York Times. So these are some themes that I'll probably be speaking to, as well as the struggle of historians to kind of make sense of these things when we're right in the middle of them, especially with documents that we're trying to piece together and figure out and make sense of. So I'm gonna cut it off right there, but maybe some of these issues hopefully I'll be able to speak to in a little while. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd like to get some discussion going now, if we could, among the panelists on some of these issues. And I will probably start it off with a question picking up on Andrew's comments. And I'd like to ask each of the panelists, do you think that Julian Assange is a Daniel Ellsberg? But before you answer, I have a small anecdote which may be a bit of a sidelight. In 1971, when Julian Assange was born and Daniel Ellsberg was leaking, I was in the Ottawa Bureau of Time magazine as correspondent. That's how old I am. 1971 was an interesting year. In Ottawa, that was the year when all the brass from Time Inc. decided to make a royal tour around their bureaus, and they all came to Ottawa. Hedley Donovan, the editor-in-chief of Time Inc., the big boss, was there. Henry Anatole Grunwald, the managing editor of Time, later American ambassador in Austria, was there. A man by the name of Murray J. Gart, who was the chief of correspondence. This trio of people came to Ottawa. My job as the local correspondent was to look after them, arrange things, make appointments, make sure they got to see Pierre Trudeau and all that stuff, the Prime Minister, which I had to do, and get a limousine for them to take them from the Chateau Laurier to the Parliament buildings, because they didn't know the distance, and they absolutely insisted it had to be a limousine, although you get in one end of the limousine, the Chateau, get out at the other end, and you're at the Parliament buildings. But anyway, that was the style they traveled in. But I was in the back of the limousine, and we were going somewhere. And it was a day that the New York Times broke the Pentagon Papers. And we're sitting in the back of the limousine, and Hedley Donovan and Henry Anatole Grunwald are just furious. They think it's absolutely irresponsible that somebody like Daniel Ellsberg would make this information public, all the secret information that the government had. That was appalling. And I couldn't figure out why they were so incensed at this. I mean, they're journalists, they're running a big media company. It's good for business to have these sorts of stories out. What I discovered on making inquiries after they left was that what had happened was that Daniel Ellsberg had a friend in Boston. Ellsberg was at Harvard, I think. He had a friend in Boston who was the Boston bureau chief of Time. And he mentioned to his friend that he had all this stuff he'd been photocopying, and would Time magazine be interested in it? And his friend, the Time bureau chief, said, well, I think so. Let me see. Why don't I arrange something? So he arranged a gathering at his home with Hedley Donovan, Henry Anatole Grunwald, and Murray J. Gart from New York, came up to Boston to meet Daniel Ellsberg. And they met him. And they were absolutely appalled by him. They said, we don't want to deal with him. We don't want anything he's peddling. We think he's some sort of a Russian spy. And they refused to accept the Pentagon Papers. After which, Daniel Ellsberg went to the New York Times and gave the New York Times the documents. So I know that from the back of the limousine that day, and they were really livid. Anyway, that's my small sidelight on Daniel Ellsberg. But let me ask you, maybe starting with Mark, do you think that Julian Assange is or will grow into a Daniel Ellsberg?
I don't think they're equivalent by a bit of a long stretch. Assange has, I think, established or tried to establish himself as a bit of a journalist. You know, he is the publication model through which all of this leaked material, and Cablegate is the biggest one, but there have been others. He is the facilitator for getting this information out. He doesn't get his hands dirty and get into the dangerous aspects of actually compromising sensitive national secrets. And I think the individual who is under suspicion in the U.S., private, whatever his name is in for a world of hurt, where Assange's legal issues are very different, and we won't get into that side of it. But I think comparing the two is a little simplistic. Ellsberg went out on a limb because he saw something that fundamentally bothered him, that said that the Vietnam War were being sold a bill of goods, and I have proof of this, and I need to get this out to the rest of my citizens. Assange seems to have a bit of an agenda, in my opinion, that says, the U.S. is bad, and if I keep publishing enough private stuff they do, eventually everyone will see something bad in there. So I would say no, they're not equivalent.
Paul, what do you think?
To the extent that I understand Ellsberg and his motivations, I'd say I agree with Mark. I don't see him as having a particular case. He seems to proceed from the view that everything the government does is, in some regards, suspect and worthy of revelation. It's indiscriminate, completely indiscriminate in its nature. It's an enormous invasion of privacy of some people. And if I had to draw a parallel between Assange and somebody, or Ellsberg and somebody, I'd say Manning is closer to Ellsberg than Assange is. On the other hand, Manning's motivations also, there seems to, one can't be sure, of course, what his motivation was, but he was a man who was having difficulties in his career. Mm-hmm. And so there's not a lot of nobility in this particular case, I don't think.
What do you think Julian Assange's motives are, Paul?
Well, I think on the one hand, he does seem to believe that the U.S. government, or maybe all governments, it's not clear to me, is somehow in a massive operation to hoodwink the population. I noticed that he gets an awful lot of ink and seems to be available a lot for cameras. Yeah. So I think I would probably say that he seems to be a guy who likes to be in the public eye as well. And this is certainly one way to do it. But I don't know. Whatever his motives are, I think they're misguided.
Andrew?
Well, I think one similarity they had is they both had pretty big egos. Daniel Ellsberg definitely he loved the media spotlight like Assange, but I think they're very, very different kinds of people. I mean, Assange for many years, and actually Mark can speak more to this kind of history than I could, but he was sort of a kind of a pioneering hacker in the 1980s, and he was always somebody who seemed to be very much kind of on the outside, sort of on the fringes, and somebody who definitely sort of moved around a lot when he was younger and so forth. And I think Ellsberg, he came from a very sturdy middle-class Chicago family, Jewish family, although they converted over to Christian Science, and he was intensely patriotic. In fact, before he kind of converted it to an anti-war activist, he actually, not only was he in the United States Marines and very devout believer in the domino theory and in what the United States was doing in Vietnam, but he was also, he tells the story that the high point of his life was when he was at a restaurant when this would have been in the mid-1960s, or early 1960s actually, if I'm remembering correctly, with a friend of his, and the thing that happened that really just changed his life was that he saw John Wayne in the restaurant, and he had to get up and go over to the Duke because the Duke was his hero, and he embodied everything that Ellsberg loved about America, the rugged individualism and the patriotism and the belief in the country and so forth. And so Ellsberg was much more invested in the country, and when he turned during the Pentagon Papers case, he really he turned because he felt that he was doing it out of a love for his country, and that love, he thought, never went anywhere. It was always there, and I never get the impression with Assange that he felt that same kind of passion that Ellsberg felt when he leaked the Pentagon Papers. So,
Mark, something to add?
Well, I know a bit of Assange's background. I wouldn't want to paint him as a typical antisocial computer geek, because that would be too broad a brush and capture too many of my friends. But I think the fact that he does seem to have a bit of an antisocial edge. There's a cynicism to his motives, as I perceive them through all the media coverage, never having met the man. But there's a cynicism to what he's doing and how he's doing it that I think maybe speaks to the virtues of what's behind it.
Let me ask you all, what do you think of the media coverage of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange? Do you think it's been fair and balanced, as Fox News would always say, or do you think it's gone over the top? Do you think it's served the public, or
it's timely? It's timely you mentioned Fox News, because I read today that apparently Assange has lots of compromising cables relating to Rupert Murdoch, the chair of Fox. So. Well, that alone almost makes me think of him as a hero.
It's pretty hard to be against that.
It really is. As a Canadian, it's hard to really not like that. But yeah, I think the media coverage is obviously sensationalized. Because as Paul indicated, we see in sort of headline formats the juiciest, gossipy pieces of it, while there's thousands of documents that you look at, and I've looked at a few of them, and I have no idea what it means. It almost looks like ciphertext. It's diplomat speak. But well, not
Good.
You wanted controversy, right? But yeah, I think the media coverage isn't necessarily doing this issue justice. I think it's too sensationalized, as many things are, and the bigger issues about how we deal with privacy and secrets, both in government and business, is largely being marginalized.
Paul?
Yeah, one of the things I'd draw everybody's attention to is how much you're not reading about WikiLeaks. For a while, it was quite it was sensational. Lately, all of the coverage is whether Assange is going to be extradited or not, and how difficult it is for him to get to his court hearings on time in the UK. So I think essentially what's happening is that the interest of the media is disappearing in the substance of the matter. Maybe, as I said, maybe that's a good thing. I find it interesting that he felt the need to work through news organizations. And I think the reason for that is it takes somebody with some expertise to interpret what they're looking at, as you were saying with the documents. And I don't think I guess he didn't have that expertise. And so he went to the New York Times and the Guardian and the Spiegel and a few others, I'm not sure all of which, in order for them to make some judgments from their perspective about what was significant and what was not significant. And even in those cases, in some of those cases, the newspapers themselves were redacting what they consider to be sensitive information, which is another criticism of his motivation. If the newspapers don't think they should print it, then it's probably the case that he shouldn't be revealing it.
Do you have any sense of how much material has been redacted by the newspapers that has not appeared that he's made available? Do you have any sense what we're missing?
I think we're missing information about people, which is, I think, all to the good, because I think there are a lot of people who could be harmed. I'm not sure anybody has been harmed, but I read some of the New York Times documents, and certainly when it referred to people, and in some cases to places, it was redacted. And they had done that in cooperation, interestingly enough, with the State Department. So whether there's a lot of it's redacted or not, I don't know. But almost everybody is getting their information not in the way that the techno geeks would like to imagine, which is sort of you get it right out of the internet and you read it yourself, and there's no intermediary. Most of it is being intermediated by newspapers.
Andrew?
Yeah, I would actually echo what Mark said about the sensationalism. I actually went and reviewed some of these WikiLeaks documents in the past, and I'm just sort of looking at them as I think a historian might look at them, and trying to see what among them might be something that perhaps 100 years from now maybe historians would find useful. And certainly there's all these kind of juicy tidbits and gossip that we've been talking about and referring to tonight. But so much of it has been the documents that I can't always make head or tail of, or many of them are these kind of sort of press reports, a roundup of different media coverage of certain activities and so forth. Actually, one of the speakers at CG in September of last year, Thomas Blanton of the National Security Archive, gave an excellent talk that you can go back and watch on the CG website about this very issue. And he actually, if you visit his National Security Archive, which also has a lot of government documents on it, declassified, but some declassified as well. He actually wrote a very interesting piece in which he talked about Wikimania and how the press has really kind of seized on the juicy tidbits, but people, it's very hard to make head or tails out of the bulk of the documents, which don't always give you a lot of information, or are very cryptic, and or are hard to distill for the media into sort of short news stories. So I think those are all issues that, when I think of media coverage, come to mind.
One of the aspects that I've seen online, like you spoke, Paul, that the print media, is providing some sort of editorial function, may not be disclosing everything that they're seeing for reasons that are valid to them. But if you go online, and it's been a little bit of whack-a-mole, because as all of the supporters of WikiLeaks are helping to facilitate copying and replicating this content, as organizations and businesses are being pressured by the US government to shut it down. Amazon was a great example of that. The companies that host the infrastructure that allows you to find WikiLeaks was pressured to not support them. But there are obviously jurisdictional challenges in countries and people that will support what they're doing. And the websites for those for the replicated WikiLeaks are getting to be pretty well organized. And while if you think there's hundreds of thousands of documents, when I was browsing through it a few weeks ago, it's structured so that you can search on Canada. You can say, well, show me all of the ones that are either coming from or going to Canada. Show me the ones about Korea. Paul, you also mentioned that the North Koreans are reading every single line of this. And I think the danger that we all have to understand there is that the technologies, again, that WikiLeaks is supporting make the searching, the organization of this massive amount of data manageable. You don't have to just literally look through 200,000 documents. You do a few keyword searches. So it's an interesting problem.
If I could make another comment on that. There's a presumption also that what's in those documents is true.
Well, it is diplomatic speak. It must be true.
It must be true. It's not Canadian diplomatic speak, so it doesn't have to be true. But one of the things and we've tended to think of this in terms of the problems this has caused the American government. Every place where these documents have been revealing things has caused problems for those countries as well. I'm thinking of a case, for example, in Turkey, where an American embassy cable referred to the Prime Minister as having some sort of offshore bank accounts. Well, maybe he does, and maybe he doesn't. I'm not sure the American embassy would actually know that. You know, maybe they're repeating stuff they've heard. Maybe it's legitimate. Maybe it's not legitimate. There's a lot of information that gets exchanged that is not quite gossip, but isn't necessarily gospel either.
But you wouldn't concede that the public's entitled to know that this is going on, being said, gossip or whatever it is, what our diplomats are doing?
No, I would. Yeah, I would argue that it's not in the public interest to know if that's going to damage the capacity of my country to conduct an effective relation on my behalf with that country. And I don't think it's in the, I don't think it's in the interests of. It might be in the interests of Turkish society to know it. If it's true, or it might be enormously disruptive and damaging if it's not true. So, and the very fact in a lot of societies that the American embassy would say something would be taken as true. I mean, it's the most powerful country in the world. It's got lots of resources. The fact that they may not understand something, they may misjudge the culture. They may misjudge what they may not even understand what's being said to them necessarily in some cases. So I think that there's it may make people feel good that information is being revealed, but it isn't necessarily a good thing because it does impede the conduct of international relations.
Andrew, any thoughts on that?
I always go back to again comparing it to the Pentagon Papers. It's an interesting comparison between the two because there were a lot of people when Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers who thought that, just as you said, there were people in the United States Congress who were calling for his execution and said he was a traitor and that he should be imprisoned and that he was endangering the lives of people overseas. And
we've even had a prominent Canadian conservative suggesting Julian Assange should be assassinated on CBC television.
Oh yeah, no, and that's I think that's a very apt comparison. And but it's interesting that that ultimately, and I don't know, because I'm always a little bit reluctant to weigh in when we're so close to WikiLeaks. It remains to be seen what history's verdict, I think, on so many of these documents will be, although I think we can look back at the Pentagon Papers and say it's a good thing that those documents were leaked because it gave people a much more accurate view of the Vietnam War, and also it gave them a fuller portrait of the actions of their elected officials. And so that at the time there was a lot of catastrophizing and a lot of although there are also plenty of people who lionized Daniel Ellsberg at the time and said he was a great man and very brave and a patriot and so forth. But Ellsberg was very much vilified at the time, and I think now history has really more or less vindicated him for that for releasing those documents. Will the same be said for WikiLeaks? Well, I don't know, because I think part of it is the challenge of trying to figure this out is that Ellsberg's release of documents was focused entirely on one thing, and that was American involvement in Vietnam. Is very, very focused, very pointed, and with WikiLeaks it's so all over the map, from Scientology to these text messages that were sent around on 9/11 in New York, which were private messages, by the way, of private citizens. I probably had no idea they would be released out there for the public to see. So, I think it's so all over the map with WikiLeaks, and so almost kind of, I don't know, it can be very chaotic with the information coming from all directions that it just doesn't, it's hard to make as much sense of it as one can with the Pentagon Papers.
Well, you recall at the time of the Pentagon Papers, the United States government went to the Supreme Court of the United States trying to stop the publication of those papers and lost the case there. In the case of Mr. Assange, the effort seems to be to get him behind bars on criminal charges, and the heck with trying to stop him. I guess technology has changed. You can't stop things the way you could have stopped the Pentagon Papers. I don't know. What would you think, Mark? Any way that they could stop?
You know,
WikiLeaks?
there are no boundaries anymore. You know, the internet has just ripped apart any notion of walls. You know, I could publish something right off my BlackBerry from this panel, and it's instantly on the web, and no matter how much I regret saying it, it's there, and it will always be there. And no matter what, how I change, you know, how I feel about it, it's persistent. There's a mirroring that goes on, and we all have to confront that. With WikiLeaks, it's to their advantage. It's a very robust system. It was designed that way. You know, the internet treats censorship as damage and just routes around it. You know, it doesn't. There's no way to just get things off the internet. And that's its power, but it also comes with one hell of a responsibility to those that are publishing things, whether it's your kids at Facebook or you know, publishing cables from a foreign government.
Okay. Thank you. I'll speak into the mic louder so people can hear me at the back. Okay. I put the mic down on request. I'll have to put it up a little bit. At this point, does anybody in the panel have anything they want to add at this point, or shall we go to the audience? Why don't we?
I like to keep talking because it doesn't hurt as much, but.
I'd like to invite the audience now to get into the act and come forward with questions for the panel, both the people who are in the room here and the people who are watching on the webcast. I think Fred, isn't there a procedure of some sort for those questions to come forward? If the webcast audience will email questions, we have people here who will run them up to the front for the panel. So what I would like to invite you to do, there are a couple of microphones on the floor. If you have questions you'd like to ask, please go to a microphone. I would ask you to introduce yourself. I would ask you to keep your questions short and to the point. Let's not have speeches. Let's have questions. And if you go too long, I will interrupt you. Suggest you sit down. Okay? Do I have any takers? Anybody want to ask anything? Anybody want to go to a microphone? There we go. Over to my right, your left. Yes, sir.
My name is John Conroy. I live in Stratford, Ontario. Fundamentally, does the panel believe that this whole issue says more about the incompetence and maybe even short-sightedness of those who are charged with protecting the great secrets of this world than it does about the criminality or perfidy of Julian Assange?
Who would you like to direct that to? Anyone in particular, or to the entire panel?
Anybody who wishes to.
I'll take a swing at this, because this really speaks to sort of a core security principle.
It's all yours, Mark. Okay.
Access control to information. You know, we all have login passwords when we go online, so we're all sort of familiar with the authentication. When you're dealing with sensitive information, you need to have protocols in place and technologies that enforce those protocols that control who has access to what information. And that's probably being done. No, those cables are not just accessible by anyone in this room. But what clearly hasn't been done is an auditing and an accountability of who's accessing them, and is anything interesting happening with that behavior. You know, me searching off in a database that I have rights to search for one or two pieces of information or documents is interesting, maybe part of my daily job. But if I pull down 200,000 documents in one day, that should set off an alarm somewhere. Or minimally, I should know that if I do that, my boss is going to find out, or the privacy officer is going to get notified. There's something that will catch that behavior and say, well, that's not typical, you know, doing your job type of data access. That's an anomaly, and that could indicate something pretty dangerous. So had that been done, maybe that guy wouldn't have gotten out of the building with the USB drive or whatever he put all those documents on. So there is a responsibility that comes along with that, and I think security is hard. You know, every time you put security in place, it makes your job a little harder. It's, you know, we're all frustrated with that, I think, in our jobs. Is, you know, if your enterprise is very security conscious, it comes at the cost of ease of use sometimes. But when you go the other way, you open yourselves up to these kind of disclosures.
You remember the attitude, public attitude, and the government's attitude, especially the U.S. government's attitude, on 9/11 and in the period following. You know, whose fault was it? Why couldn't we connect the dots? We have to share this information. We have to take down the walls between the FBI and the CIA and State Department, Defense Department, and everybody, all of the other organizations that are involved. My presumption is that this is the leak is a consequence of a deliberate attempt to get that information into the hands of more than one person. And so there you run into the technology problem. If you do that, it is accessible. And it may not be, and that obviously was not caught before it happened. So, you know, it's the law of unintended consequences. You make a big effort to correct one problem, and you find you've created another one.
Andrew, do you want to swing
I
at that
don't
one?
think I really have very much to add. I mean, I think that security is, even at its best, is very imperfect. I myself, about a year and a half ago, was a victim of having all of my bank accounts and charge cards hijacked, and it's a very very disorienting kind of thing to have happen. And it sort of is a rude awakening that teaches you that all of these security measures are vulnerabilities, there are chinks in the armor, and there are ways to get in, and if you try hard enough. I'm actually amazed. What amazes me is in this age of the internet that WikiLeaks didn't happen until 2010, as opposed to several years ago. It's interesting that it took this long, given all of the weaknesses.
Do we have one over here again?
Yeah, my name is Roxy, and I have a question. My question is in regards to the providers of this leaked information. Paul addressed this briefly, but can any of you comment on your feelings in regards to if you think any informant worldwide that before this leak may have provided information in regards to human rights violations or anything, perhaps now feels repressed instead of speaking out to American diplomats and beyond? There have been reports that since this leak, informants in Indonesia, Russia, and beyond have gone missing and unaccounted for. Has this share, perhaps, of information become repressed simply out of safety concerns due to lack of anonymity?
Could you hear that? Could you reach? I'm sorry to say this, but in this room there are places where the sound is not good.
We couldn't hear it very well. Could you sort of compress it into a short sentence, and we'll see what we can do with it?
All I'm asking is, because of this leak of information, are there perhaps people who would have spoken up in the past now repressed, and information isn't going to be shared as easily in the future due to a lack of anonymity and perhaps even safety?
Well, it's going to be one of those things that you could never prove because you can't prove a negative. But it's a reasonable assumption that people will be a lot more careful if they think there is a risk that what they're saying is going to be revealed. That goes for newspapers, that goes for doctors, it goes for diplomats, it goes for whoever has to deal with other people in confidence. If those people can't be confident that their information is going to be protected, and if it poses a risk to themselves then to reveal it, then chances are they're not going to do it. In some sense, it will seem, I guess, as though business will carry on as usual, but you just don't know what might have happened absent this kind of a risk.
You could argue that making information this open has perhaps even made the world, or can make the world, a less open place.
I have no doubt that one of the consequences is going to be that governments will work harder to protect the information, and as a result of that, when it comes 30 or 40 years or whenever you get the documents, there's going to be a lot of information that's not going to be in those documents, because people will take steps to make sure that nothing is written down, that communications are oral, and maybe someday we'll get to an access to information law that will deal effectively with that, but I doubt it. Because what will happen is that the people who have information that they feel must be protected for whatever reason, legitimate or not, but I'm going to presume legitimate in most cases, are going to make sure that it doesn't get out, or they're going to do whatever they can to make sure that it's not going to get out.
As it happens, I have a question from one of the watchers on the webcast. This is Gabriel from Boca Raton in Florida, who says on this point, Paul Heinbecker suggested that diplomacy may no longer be recorded. Could a government citizens argue that this outcome is unfair and perhaps unconstitutional? This question.
The citizens can argue whatever they want, but if they don't know what's going on, they're not going to be able to make the argument. And that's part of the reason why the information will be kept protected. And by the way, we do elect governments, and we elect governments to govern and to make responsible decisions. And if we have governments that make irresponsible decisions, I guess it's up to us to change them. The idea that you have to open up every piece of information so that the public can make its own judgment about what the government is doing just doesn't stand up to examination. For example, we have budgets in this country. The budgets are secret, largely, because people can make money off them if they find out ahead of time what's going to be in the budget, where the taxes are going up, where they're going down, what the changes are going to be. We protect that information. They don't protect it in the United States. They have a very different system. They put the budget, the administration puts the budget on the table in February, and by October it gets passed. But the administration is not going to fall. The government is not going to fall if the budget is changed. In our system, which operates on the basis of confidence, the government has to be, if the government finds that information that it's got in the budget has gotten into the wrong hands, it's a crisis. It cost an election probably to the Liberals the last time they were in office, when the RCMP started to investigate a budget leak in the middle of an election campaign. And
then the RCMP leaked the fact that they were investigating the leak, and that's what did it. Anybody else on the panel have anything on this, or shall I go to
Just
another?
one final comment about that. There's a desire and a motivation in governments, certainly Western governments, for transparency, but transparency doesn't mean the absence of secrets and confidences. I think as Paul has said, we operate with a necessity to guard some information very carefully in order to function. And if those confidences are broken, we lose out, whether it's the human rights violations people reporting or stock manipulation. So these are all necessary things to have as secrets.
Microphone over here.
Hi there. My name is Luke Stewart. I'm a PhD student in history at UW. I found there was a context that was lacking in this conversation, and that was the general attitude in the military towards the war and an increasing dissension within the military towards the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's why I think you have these documents that are being leaked, much like the Pentagon Papers. And in the absence of a strong anti-war movement like there was during the Vietnam War, we don't have the type of civil society to carry this information through for it to be absorbed by the public so the public can make an informed decision if we do truly live in a democracy. So my question would be is that with this context of growing dissent within the military and veterans themselves speaking out, coupled with the fact that the war in Afghanistan cost $6 billion a month, important information has come out again about the war that is being waged, like for the fact the corruption in the Karzai government that might not be new to you guys, but it is new to the American population who don't follow it. I mean, there is important information coming out. The U.S. government has a body count. It said it didn't have a body count, a civilian casualty body count. And in the WikiLeaks, it's come out that the U.S. government was paying attention to the amount of civilians being killed. So isn't there truly a public interest? I mean, it's not just a one-off thing that's happening here. You do have veterans speaking out more and more. Unfortunately, they're just not being reported in the media like they're not reporting WikiLeaks. So in the absence of a strong anti-war movement like in Vietnam, where are we left to have? what is, I mean,
Who are you addressing your question to?
well, I guess I'll address my comments to Dr. Hunt because he knows a lot about dissent during the Vietnam War, and Mr. Heinbecker.
Dr. Hunt.
Hunt, okay. It's very hard to hear, believe me.
It is hard.
No, I hear what you're saying, and I think that an important piece of context that probably hasn't entered the discussion as much as probably is necessary is I think the fact that, and I of course bring this up mostly as a U.S. historian of U.S. history, is the long history of covert wars, of secrecies, of destabilizing governments with whom Washington disagrees. And I mean, there are all kinds of black marks and dark, very, very dark tales in the history of U.S. foreign policy. And what you're speaking to, I think, can probably be plugged into that somehow. And that's that kind of broad panorama of this very dark history of covert wars and overthrowing regimes and so forth that has been so much a part of foreign policy since World War II. And certainly, when trying to have a balanced discussion of it, I think that this kind of hidden history of foreign policy, sometimes not so hidden, has to be taken into account as well, and that many of the secrets that have been covered up have been absolutely nefarious and have been covered up for a reason, because if they're made public, that people will be appalled by what they find out. And so I think that that's a very real element, and I think that WikiLeaks probably does. I mean, given the number of documents coming out, I'm sure that there's that side of American foreign policy that some of those documents speak to. I don't know how much of the documents really speak to those issues. I get the impression that it's so all over the map that that's kind of a small percentage, but I would be interested in the years ahead as more documents come out to get a sense of whether they're raising these very legitimate concerns about foreign policy, or whether they're the kind of damaging leaks that we've talked about earlier that really harm privacy and undermine diplomacy.
I'd like to ask, I'd like to make a couple of points, I think. One is, you presumed that there was growing dissension in the military ranks. I live in Ottawa. I know a lot of the military. I don't notice, if there's a dissension growing, I don't see it. I think there's a dissatisfaction on the part of the Canadian public. I don't think I've seen the military share that. There may be some, obviously, but generally speaking, that would not be the impression. The second thing I would say is, insofar as the revelations about the Karzai government are concerned, I think you could turn that around and say it's gratifying or encouraging that our representatives know what's going on and are trying to deal with it. No one said doing this, what they're doing in Afghanistan, was going to be easy. We're not doing it entirely for the sake of the Afghans. Part of it is self-interest. But we're doing it fully conscious of the problems, of the corruption in the government, of the incompetence in the government, of the relationships with the Pakistani intelligence services, with the Taliban, all of that stuff. But you're left at the end with a very difficult problem, and that is, this has been a source of terrorism that has affected this continent, this United States. Canadians died in it. Do you just walk away in the hope that that's going to, if you do, but in doing so, you remove the cause of the trouble, or not? And some people, and I'm of both minds on this, would say that hopes are not policies, hopes are not strategies. It may be very difficult, but we took the view, and we should have taken the view from the very beginning, that it was going to be difficult. There are still American soldiers in Germany. There's still American soldiers in Japan. There's still American soldiers in Korea. These are not things that are going to be over in the short term. And if your policy is that you can't stand being there, then you should probably not go there in the first place. you should have found some other way of trying to respond to that problem.
Thank you. Let me try another web question, and this one is from George in Cambridge, who asks, have these series of leaks informed the general public on how the diplomatic process works, and is the information on the functioning of these diplomatic processes of value to the citizens in a democratic society? Andrew?
Now, can you repeat that again? I was sort of following it and kind of...
Have the series of leaks informed the general public on how the diplomatic processes work, and is the information on the functioning of the diplomatic processes of value to the citizens in a democratic society?
I probably couldn't speak to that question as well as Paul could. I certainly think that it has, some of the documents have illuminated or have shed light on the diplomatic process and have been educational. And so, I mean, I know that when I've, just answering from that question from a purely personal standpoint, I know that I've learned some things. I think I always look at these documents with a grain of salt. I think it was Mark who very wisely mentioned earlier that, I mean, we're so in the middle of the vortex that we're not even sure what, I mean, we still have to verify the veracity of some of these documents, and certainly, but there have been some documents that have been released that have, I think, been interesting and educational and have taught me some things about the diplomatic process that I didn't know. But I, as somebody who hasn't really focused on that area of history, I would defer to somebody like Paul who has had that experience. So.
Well, I guess probably it has informed people about a little bit more about how diplomacy works. Diplomacy, I used to say diplomacy is sort of one part analyst, one part saloon keeper, one part salon keeper, one part flagpole. You know, you're representing your country, you're trying to find out what's going on, and you're trying to report home what's going on. And I think if you look through many of those cables, you couldn't, I think, help but be impressed at the quality of the work that's been done. Here and there's you know, cases where I don't think it's necessary to put in the lascivious details about leaders' foibles. I don't think that helps very much, and I think it almost assures that it's going to get leaked somewhere. And I don't think, you know, if the American embassy in Ottawa was busy critiquing the CBC and its programming, I think that they should have had more important things to be doing than that.
I think so.
But on the other hand, you know, if you look at some of that, you get a very clear-eyed view of what's going on in places like Afghanistan and in China and in Korea and so on. And I think that it's, in that sense at least, it probably has been beneficial in the sense that it's made diplomacy, it's explained a little bit what it is, and it's probably reestablished the brand a little bit, because what diplomats are doing on a daily basis is finding out what's going on, cultivating relationships, trying to get to know people for the day when you're going to need to know those people, and reporting back to your government what needs to be known so that they can make the correct decisions.
Mark?
Well, I guess as the layman who is not a diplomat or a historian, my view of this is sort of, it's like seeing inside the sausage factory. You know, I don't really understand what all the machines do. I'm reading stuff, some of it's interesting, some of it doesn't make any sense. In terms of whether it's a good civics lesson, probably are better ways to understand how the diplomatic corps works and, you know, and all the moving parts in there, rather than a mass disclosure of documents, because I don't have a context for what I'm reading that someone who is on the inside does. And if I draw conclusions from it, I do so at my own peril. Much as if someone gave me a medical record and I looked at it, I wouldn't know necessarily if it was good or bad. But.
Question over here.
Hello, my name's Joe. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Waterloo in English and French. My question is directed primarily at Mr. McArdle, but feel free to answer it if you want to touch in. WikiLeaks obviously is founded on the principle of accountability. Do you think it has potential to provide, in addition to public accountability within government, corporate accountability? Do you think that Mr. Assange's threats will be followed up with some actual dirt on corporations? And if so, that'll help the public respond and create a better world for themselves, or if in fact it will just be this petty secret trading that we're seeing about the American government and not really aimed at any actual improvement.
Well, first, I wouldn't necessarily agree that WikiLeaks is accountable or forces accountability. I think that's to be determined. I certainly would think, though, that corporate secrets are no different than government secrets. And if there are insiders who see a company doing something wrong, a very focused disclosure that indicates what that wrongdoing is, WikiLeaks may be a great venue for that. I think, though, if the model would be more like what we've seen with the cables, where someone just goes off and rips off 2 million lines of Microsoft source code and publishes it inside WikiLeaks as proof of why your Windows machine is slow, I think that would be problematic. That's again, a wholesale mass theft of intellectual property or secrets without a real focused purpose behind it. But I think these are things that I think if we follow the trajectory, the recording industry was the first one to really get its butt kicked by the internet, and its secrets being disclosed and replicated and mirrored, fundamentally changing that business forever. WikiLeaks is sort of having that impact on government. Corporate secrets, certainly within the realm of possibility that the secret for Coca-Cola could appear on WikiLeaks someday. Whether that's good or bad is someone else's historian's perspective.
Speaking of an historian's perspective, I have a question here from the webcast. This is from Andrew in Waterloo, who directs this one to Andrew specifically, he says. What effect do you think WikiLeaks will have on academia? What degree of scholarship can rest on these documents, considering the authors may not have willingly divulged their opinions?
It's an excellent question.
It is.
A very, very good question. I think it's going to have some kind of a big impact. I think, like I said, we're still kind of early in the game, and we historians are always a little nervous when we're this early on into an issue like this one, of weighing in too heavily. But it's already had an influence on academic scholarly work. There are already scholarly conferences that are being organized on WikiLeaks and on information that are being held at university campuses around North America. It's generating a great deal of interest in the scholarly community, WikiLeaks is. I've already talked to a graduate student, not working with me, but a graduate student who was using some WikiLeaks documents in his research. And so they're already having an impact on academe, and I think they will continue to have an impact. I think that's where historians come in, because I think historians have been trained to be able to assess these kinds of documents, get a sense of their significance, their importance, which ones are relevant to the historical record, and which ones are perhaps less so. And hopefully we can weigh in along with political scientists and all other academics who are using these documents to try to figure out what's happening in the world. But again, I would emphasize that it's being so early in this drama that's unfolding. It remains to be seen to what extent these documents, which are so all over the map, will be used by the academic community.
All right, question over here.
Yes, Terry Moran, Cambridge. In this room, I've at least 3 times heard presentations by diplomats to Afghanistan, and was assured at least 3 times that things were going smoothly, that we were on a winning course and could work well with their government. I now find that I was lied to. I don't believe that democracy can function when it's being lied to by the people in power. This theory, I believe, was first put out by Leo Strauss, the noble lie that the elite tell the rest of us. I think it's been embraced by the American and Canadian government.
Could you put this into a question, please?
Why do you believe the mainstream media has not kept us informed of the lies presented by those in power?
Who would like that one?
I sure don't.
Paul?
Yeah, I guess I just disagree with you. I can understand the point you're making. If you go back to the Manley Commission said to the government that it needs to communicate better and more straightforward with the Canadian people. Since that time, there has been a quarterly report, and in those quarterly reports, it certainly has not said things are going swimmingly, everything is fine, don't worry about it. They've been pretty frank in what they've been saying. They may not have said this is a corrupt government that we're dealing with, because they have to deal with that government. For the same reason why it's embarrassing and problematic for our ambassador in Kabul to find his words saying this is a corrupt government reported in the newspapers, because he has to deal with those people afterwards. But in terms of what the government has said in recent years, I think if you read my book, I guess it's time for me to advertise my book. Getting back in the game, Foreign Policy Playbook for Canada. I do make the point that I think the government has been much less open about communications, much less effective on communications than it needs to have been. For example, 3 or 4 Taliban attacked that enormous Canadian-American base in Kandahar. Does anybody think that they're going to win by doing that? No. What they're going to do is get a headline. And what's sensible for the Canadian government is to be sure that you're communicating what's going on, and so the people give you the benefit of the doubt. When I was, this is a much simpler case, but when we were in Kosovo, we had a press conference on the record every day, somebody from Foreign Affairs, somebody from DND, from the military in fact, answering questions for half an hour, 45 minutes, every day, no matter what happened. And when difficult things came along, we got a little bit of slack from people who understood that we were trying to do the best we could in difficult circumstances. If you don't have the confidence of people, then they start, not believing you. But I don't think it's the case, because I've been reading those quarterly reports, and those quarterly reports are pretty frank.
Anyone else?
Well, I would simply say that I always sort of warn my students in my courses not to generalize too much about the media, because certainly we've gotten some distorted information, but also the negative reports that have fueled some of the doubts about what's happening in Afghanistan have also come from the media, whether it's been online media or television, online newspapers, online magazines, and webcasts, radio, streaming radio, and so forth. So I would be careful to not generalize too much about the media, especially in this age of the internet when it's so scattered and so much more accessible. So.
Can I take one more question, Fred? Are we running out of time or what? Okay. Can I go to this microphone then? Thank you. Sorry, I'll speak up. This microphone over here.
Hi, my name is Sammy, and in this discussion, it's been heavily emphasized that when the information gets in the wrong hands, it could be catastrophic. But I was just wondering, is there any information you feel that the public is better served by knowing through WikiLeaks as opposed to periodic government declassification of documents?
Good question.
Well, I'd just say a focused disclosure of wrongdoing. You know, if you see something that is clearly against the law or in contradiction to, you know, what we're being told as citizens, then disclosing proof of that is a noble, patriotic thing to do. I don't think that's what we're seeing right now, but in those cases, that's an appropriate thing to do. That's why we have whistleblowers.
I would agree. I think that that releases of some documents that are sensitive or classified is actually a good thing in some instances, especially when it exposes some kind of harmful policy that is being carried out that is doing some sort of harm around the world. And I don't think the government, and I guess this is my sort of libertarian side talking, I don't think the government government officials have always been the best judge of what should be released and what shouldn't. I mean, and that's coming from somebody who's worked a lot with government documents. It's sort of the like letting the wolf guard the hen house, so to speak. They have a vested interest, and they're not going to release a whole lot of information that might make government not look so positive. So I think that in some cases some of these leaks can be very beneficial, and just what Mark said in terms of exposing wrongdoing and so forth. One can hope that there will be some good judgment used so that there won't be any releases of information that will jeopardize lives or give away people's private lives, and will simply reveal these kinds of issues that we're talking about now. But it seems like with WikiLeaks that hasn't always been the case. It's sort of been, like I said, all over the place.
Could I make one point that it might help to clarify in people's minds the business of declassifying information, making information public? There's the Access to Information Act and there's the Evidence Act. I think it's called the Evidence Act. Under the Access to Information Act, the government is justified, is permitted to withhold information that could damage international relations. And under the Evidence Act, it's permitted to withhold information that would damage international relations. The second is a much tougher test to meet than the first, but it's the first that is the one that under which the access to information system works. If you want to have much more disclosure, then you'd better get the law changed and make the test more difficult for the government, because as it is now, governments are within the law to withhold a very great deal of information that you might think ought not to be withheld. They're not able to do that in the case of court cases.
Thank you. I am going to cut it off at this point with just a couple of brief comments and picking up on what Paul Einbecker just had to say, which sort of goes back to what I had to say at the beginning about the access and the availability of information. It seems to be that one of the problems that we've had for some time is a lack of clarity in the classification systems. What really should be secret, what should be confidential, what's regarded as private, and what should never be given out. And we don't have that. It seems to be every civil servant has a chance to stamp a document the way he wants. And I wrote a piece in the Record recently, and I cited an actual case that I was aware of from my days in Ottawa with a request for information. It had to do with a federal provincial conference. I mean, no big secrets and any of that stuff, particularly it was some years before. The access request took a number of months to be fulfilled to produce the documents for this conference. One of the documents in the package, stamped confidential, was a menu from the parliamentary restaurant, for all things, Now, you wonder why, and you look at that and you say, it would make better sense if there were proper system of classification, if not so many people were stamping these documents. As far as WikiLeaks is concerned, I would feel much better about WikiLeaks if I had a better sense of the motives of Julian Assange. I'm really suspicious. I think it detracts from what he says he is trying to do. and it would be really good to have a better sense of where he's going. What has he got out there, and why is he doing it? Anyway, I would like to thank the panelists tonight. Thank Paul Heinbecker for his wisdom and his participation despite his pain tonight. Andrew Hunt for his perspective, and Mark for telling us all the techno-geek stuff that we didn't know. Anyway, but thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Yes, I too would like to thank Mark, Andrew, Paul, and also I'd like to thank Jeff Stevens, our moderator. I found this, I'll declare my own bias, to be an excellent discussion. I found it very illuminating, and I come away believing more than ever in both the noble purpose of the whistleblower and also the scariness of WikiLeaks, the potential to, as one of our panelists said to me earlier tonight, thank God Julian Assange doesn't have the nuclear bomb, because he might use it. Of course, as we can see, the internet can itself be very explosive. So thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. Thanks again to our public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. The video from tonight's live webcast will be edited and posted to CG's website in our online video archive, should you wish to share this discussion with others. We have copies of op-eds published on the WikiLeaks debate by CG's Paul Heinbecker and Mark Cedra, and by Andrew Hunt and Jess Stevens. That can be picked up from our publications table at the back of the room. Our next public event, please mark your calendars, is on Wednesday, February 2nd at 7 p.m. here in the atrium. And the topic is Warm Front or Deep Freeze, International Climate Policy in 2011, featuring CG Distinguished Fellow Dave Reynolds and CG's Jason Blackstock, with a seasoned and preeminent panel of global climate change experts. So we welcome you back then, and thank you again for coming tonight.
The plan is that we will take the first hour or so for the panel. They will speak for about 5 minutes each, and there will be some back and forth among the panelists. And after that, a little after 8 o'clock, I will declare the session open to questions from both the audience here and those watching the webcast podcast. So try to get as much participation as we can, and that'll go on until half an hour, 45 minutes or so of audience participation. Fred said that I would declare my bias, so I'll do that. I'm not sure, given my bias, that I should be a moderator, but I will do my best to be even-handed. I spent 15 years in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. That was through the period of the evolution, introduction, and ultimately passage of the Access to Information Act, a subject which I have written about many, many times. My bias is that I am an open government person. I believe that the government, which gathers information at the taxpayer's expense, should make that information available to the public, all of that information, unless there's some compelling reason why they should not make it available. Otherwise, I think the test has to be on the government to explain why it's not going to make information available. The test should not be on the public to provide information as to why they should be given that access. That's my basic bias. I was in the gallery in Ottawa in the mid-'60s. When the first private members' attempts to introduce freedom of information legislation began. Barry Mather from...
On political subjects, the most recent of which is The Player, The Life and Times of Dalton Camp, which won the Writers' Trust of Canada's Drainey Taylor Prize for the Best Biography of 2003. And two of his books were chosen by Samara Canada in July 2010 for its Best of Canadian Political Books. He's currently working with the Honourable Flora MacDonald on her memoirs. In June 2007, Mr. Stevens was awarded an honorary Doctor of Letters by Laurier for his unique and outstanding lifelong contribution to political reporting and public discourse across Canada, and he's a director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, chair of the CGF's Lifetime Achievement Jury, and a judge of the annual National Newspaper Awards. And so therefore very interested in the WikiLeaks issue, which is also a media issue. I want to thank tonight's sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, and I also want to thank our webcast audience for attending. Later on tonight, all audience members will have a chance to ask questions from the mics that'll be open towards the end of the evening, and we'll also be taking questions from our webcast audience. So now I'll turn it over to Jeff Stevens. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Fred. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be here this evening for this event on a topic which is of immense interest, the WikiLeaks saga, which is certainly not over. It's all unfolding in front of us. My job is supposed to be a fairly minimal job here. My job is to introduce the panelists and then get out of the way and let them go at it, and then give you a chance to go at them. Not proper time constraints in the production of documents, all kinds of difficulties with the Act, but I'm more disappointed in the reaction of governments in not dealing with the Act and trying to make it possible for the public to find out what their government is really up to. Gives you just one small example. 2000, trying to remember the year, in 2000, I think, there was a young reporter from the Globe and Mail, was posted to Ottawa. He didn't know anybody in town. And what do you do when you don't know anybody? We spent a lot of time hanging around the House of Commons, talking to people, saying, what's going on, what do I need to know? And he started hearing rumors about a funny program operating out of the Prime Minister's office, giving money to people in Quebec to promote certain things. He put in an access to information request for some documents that should have been readily available. These are documents from reports on advertising campaigns. It took 2 years before the government finally gave him the information, and that blew open, of course, the sponsorship scandal, which Sheila Fraser, as the Auditor General, picked up on, and then ultimately we had the Mr. Justice Gomery with his inquiry into that situation. $320 million of taxpayers' money, which sort of down that rat hole. And if the government had had its way, of course, none of that information would ever have come out. So I am an open government person. That's my bias. I will try to control it as we go on this evening. Let me start. What I'm going to do, I will just briefly identify each of the panelists, and then I'll come up and introduce them more properly before they speak. Okay? We are going to start tonight with Mark McArdle on my extreme right. Our second speaker will be the speaker on my immediate left, Paul Heinbecker, who has already been identified and by
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Public Affairs at CG. And the interview clip you were just watching was a preview of our new podcast series, Inside the Issues. And this one featured the CG Distinguished Fellow Paul Heinbecker on Canada's downsizing diplomacy. And Paul is on our panel tonight. Happy New Year, and welcome back to CG's public programming. Our first event for 2011 is tonight's panel, WikiLeaks, Security, Diplomacy, and Global Gossip. WikiLeaks, as you probably know if you're interested enough to come out tonight, is an international not-for-profit founded in 2006, 2007. It's a website, and it acts as an intermediary between whistleblowers and the public. And it became even more controversial than it's ever been this past fall when thousands of diplomatic cables were posted to the website. So that's our topic, and just before we launch in, we'd like to acknowledge in our audience Peter Braid, MP for Kitchener-Waterloo. We're very grateful to our funding partners in the Government of Canada and the province of Ontario. I'll now introduce our moderator, and he'll introduce our panelists after declaring his own bias on the issue. Jeffrey Stevens is our moderator tonight, and he's a journalist, author, and teacher. He's been the Ottawa columnist, sports editor, and managing editor of the Globe and Mail, and the Ottawa correspondent for the Time magazine and managing editor of Maclean's magazine. He writes a column on politics every Monday in The Record in Kitchener-Waterloo and the Mercury in Guelph. Mr. Stevens is the author or co-author of 4 books.
From the NDP, Jed Baldwin from the Conservatives, and John Reid from the Liberals, all introduced private members' bills over a period of years, and of course the governments weren't much interested in that. Those efforts, didn't really want freedom of information, and the bills all died on the order paper. One of those 3, John Reid, ultimately became the Information Commissioner. And I had, actually, after he stepped down as Information Commissioner, I had a chance to talk to him at another conference, and he was saying, you know, all the years I was Information Commissioner, it was 7 or 8 years, I guess, he said, I had hundreds of occasions to look at documents which the government was trying to prevent from being released. And he would review the documents. He was privy councillor. He had that sort of access. He reviewed those documents. He said, I didn't find one single case where there was some compelling reason why the government information could not be made public, national security, national defense, or anything else. What I did find in every case was a desire by the government to avoid embarrassment of the publication of this information. It's not terribly surprising that when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, he did not reappoint John Reid as Information Commissioner. However, John, I covered the introduction of the Access to Information Bill in 1979. Joe Clark picked it up in that election campaign. He wanted an issue which he thought would be popular. I don't know whether it was or not, but he picked that issue up, introduced the legislation to create what is now the Access to Information Act. Unfortunately, the government fell before it got passed, but Pierre Trudeau picked it up in his when he came back to power in 1980 and proceeded with that legislation, which ultimately passed and came into force in 1983. I guess I'm like most people in the journalistic community. I'm really disappointed in the act. I'm disappointed in the way it's drafted. I think there are huge loopholes in it. It leaves far too much leeway to the government. There are